mean, it's also really important to
Which email?
User phone contact. Set URL, like kind of custom stuff.
That you might be better off.
He is the maintainer of wp-cli and a sponsor of Yoast to work on WordPress core. He maintains the bootstrap low component and tries to tackle architectural pain points of this popular CMS. Passionate about software and architecture and code quality, he never misses an opportunity to share best practices and tries to live up to his educational aspirations through public speaking and blogging. Read his thoughts on code and other things at https://www.alainschlesser.com or say hello on Twitter under the handle @/. The session is Embracing Gutenberg in Existing Code. Thank you.
Hello everyone. So this talk will mainly concern developers and product owners in WordPress space, but it's not, I try to focus more on the concepts than on the nitty-gritty code details. So I hope that everyone can take something out of it. So we all know by now, I think, that Gutenberg will soon be merged into WordPress core at one point. And if you own a WordPress plugin, a WordPress theme, or some other product that tightly integrates with the WordPress ecosystem, then you might be wondering how best to go about adapting to this upcoming change, how to modify your code so that it works with the Gutenberg requirements. So I want to go through a few concepts of Gutenberg first, and then I'll discuss a way of gradually moving your code over from the old WordPress way to the new WordPress. So first of all, with Gutenberg, there will be architectural changes that are coming. This means that there are a few challenges ahead that you need to solve for your specific product. I'll refer to product from now on, meaning all plugins and themes and similar. So these challenges, they're not something that's very new in the software engineering world, but some of them might be new for the WordPress world and how WordPress has previously been known to work. So first of all, the first challenge is that we will see a move from the server side to the client side. So Gutenberg itself basically runs on the client side as a JavaScript application. So this means that where on the old system, like WordPress works now, when you click on a link in an admin page, it will not change this admin page. It will basically forward that link that was clicked to the server and request a new page to be downloaded. So the client side is only ever one single page that gets downloaded. The server sends the output, and the browser renders it, and if you click on a link, that request goes back to the server, and the server will render and send forward the next output for the client. When we have moved to the client side, like with Gutenberg, this changes a bit. So basically now the server, for building an admin page, for example, where you have the Gutenberg editor, the server will send both logic and data to the client, and then the client will manage its own state until whatever the purpose of that page is completely processed. So you can see that when we click on links on the client side, we never go back to the server. It's only when a specific action happens, like clicking on the save button, that the state that was managed on the client side will pass back to the server. So this is a very fundamental change, and it basically means that you need to be aware of where your data is currently at, where your state is at, and know that you need to balance the server and the client components and make sure that both fulfill their part of the business transaction. The main challenge with this is that it can, if you just use the old PHP way of doing things, it can potentially lead to security issues. So what you cannot simply do is use the data that you would normally use on the server to make a decision and render the output and send that entire data to the client. Because that data might, for example, include the user ID to be used to decide whether the user has access to the given resource and can act on that resource. So if you just send over that user ID to the client side and then make the decision on the client side, just as you did on the server side, you can quickly hit security implications, because on the client side, the environment is insecure by default. So the client side basically means it runs in the browser. Anyone who knows the shortcut to enter the developer tools in the browser will be able to just change that user ID. So instead of being random visitor number 703, they can change their ID to being admin number 1, and all of a sudden you have access to it. So it's very important to know that the way you develop on the server does not directly translate to the way you develop on the client. There's always that fundamental principle that the client needs to be considered insecure, and all data validation and all logic that makes impactful decisions needs to happen on the server side. The next challenge that we will face is that Gutenberg more tightly integrates with the REST API. The REST API is the default mechanism to work with the data, to manipulate the data, but this comes with a few caveats that you need to be aware of that don't apply directly to the server side. So for example, REST API requests, they are expensive. So there's always a network round trip. When you click on something that loads data, it will forward that request to the server will process it, and the server will send back the data. So that's 2 times an entire network round trip, which can cause a lot of latency. Also, requests are expensive in a different way, because depending on how much data you actually send from the server to the client, this costs real money to your users. Instead of just downloading the end result, they will download all of the communication that happens between the client and the server all the time. So you need to make sure that all your requests are as lean and efficient as possible, because otherwise this will cost real dollars to people on expensive mobile bandwidth, for example. Also, the REST conventions, they are limited on purpose. Basically, the REST principles are based on the HTTP verbs. So we have get, put, post, delete, etc. And you work with resources and use these verbs. This is different than when you work on the server side, where you can randomly create whatever methods you want. You can name them any way you want, and you never need to completely shape the CRUD interface for an entire resource. So with the REST API, it's limited on purpose. This comes with a lot of benefits, but you need to be aware of this when you have your custom data that you want to map to a new REST API endpoint. It's much more difficult to properly model this so that it fits within the REST API principles, the way the REST API is meant to work. The next challenges that come up is that the front end that will be rendered on the Gutenberg side is not arbitrary HTML mockup anymore. it is React components. So that's also a fundamental shift, where previously you had, in some places you generated the entire markup, in some other places you generated the entire style sheet, in some other place you generated the entire JavaScript code. Now this is all subdivided into encapsulated components. So each component has its logic, its markup, and its styles potentially. This is a different way to go about. It comes, again, with everything in software engineering. It comes with advantages and disadvantages. The big advantage is that it is much easier to scale it, because you never need to deal with all the markup in one spot or all the styles in one spot. But it also makes it a bit more difficult than to adapt currently existing code that uses these old paradigms and map it into React components. It's not an easy task to do the design work that is needed for that, the software design work. And this will probably cause a lot of headaches in the beginning to know what the best way is to define the actual components. There's a lot of built-in components that come out of the box with Gutenberg. There's a handbook page that provides a reference with these components. And basically, they are the default building blocks that you can use to build a React-based page that uses the Gutenberg architecture. And you can also use these as your own starting points and extend them. So for example, you can use the button component and extend it by making your call to action button out of it. So always think about reusing what is already there. This always provides lots of benefits, because if you want to build everything from scratch, you will probably spend a lot of time with boilerplate code that does not produce any business value. The next challenge that comes up that is a bit more conceptual in nature, and a lot of people have trouble with grasping concept, is the data flow that is used with Gutenberg. The data flow is based on Redux. Redux is a React flavored version of a Flux architecture. So basically it tries to solve the issues that come with more complex state management at scale. Because the more your software grows, the more difficult it is to make sure that state changes don't interfere one with the other or cause conflicts or random bugs. And the way Redux goes about to solve this is to create an immutable data flow. So basically, Redux sends the state into your components, and for all practical purposes, this state is immutable. This means you cannot directly change this state. What you can do to make behavior work is to create an action and dispatch this action. This will then be dispatched by Redux by using what is called a reducer. It's basically an action is an event and a reducer is an event handler. They use, unfortunately, very complex terms for pretty simple concepts. So basically, you create an event, dispatch this event, Redux will run all the event handlers on this event, and the event handlers calculate the new state for the next iteration. And that new state will be passed on again from the top to the next cycle of your component. So you never directly change the state, but you can trigger changes to happen and be fed into your component for the next iteration. This has a lot of direct and indirect benefits. It basically makes it very easy to trace back what happened with your state, where did it change, who changed it, and it also makes it almost impossible to get random bugs because of conflicts of timing, where one component reads state changes it, another component reads it as well and changes it as well. If the timing is a bit off, one might read immediately before the next one changes it, and then when it changes it again, it will override the change that the other component made. So with a flow like this problem can be easily avoided. It makes for a lot more boilerplate code there. So instead of doing an assignment like you're used to, just saying variable A is now 3, you will say, well, I now dispatch the action set variable A with a value of 3, and I have a reducer that calculates the new state of that variable, etc., etc. So the code seems more complex at first because there's much more boilerplate code. But at scale, it is actually an advantage because you never need to consider the entire thing to reason about what it's currently doing. You can zoom in on details and just care about these details, and you know that there's no unexpected side effects happening with the code you have in front of you. That's a general principle when you need to deal with growing complexity. You want to include mechanisms that might add to the overall complexity, but allow you to zoom in on specific subsets and know that within that subset, we're working in an isolated environment and we don't need to take any side effects into account. So we can reason about a smaller portion of the complexity at one time. The Redux data flow that is used for Gutenberg is extended. There's an abstracted component called @WordPress/data. This package basically uses this Redux flow and adds a few additional modularization features so that you can easily reuse it across core and plugins and themes as well. One of the main issues with JavaScript code in general is that it always supposes that it is just being built in one go for the entire application, which is not true for WordPress, because WordPress, the application, is core and plugins, and they are independent. So you will see, with Gutenberg, you will see a lot of extensions like the WordPress data package that basically provide the plugin extensibility for WordPress in a JavaScript context. So there was a lot of very complicated concepts, and given all I've told you now, it might seem that you will need to completely rewrite your plugin, your product, from scratch to make it work, because there's so many fundamental changes that there's no way you can just make one change in one location and have it just work. It will just randomly break then. So how do you get from your current version of a server-side based PHP plugin to a Gutenberg block that is based on React components and uses the fancy Redux flow? Let's think about a plugin that uses the traditional ways of PHP to build shortcodes and widgets and page integrations, etc. So there must be a way to not need to finish the rewrite from scratch completely until you see the first result of it. Because as a business owner, very probably, you always are interested in not the overall cost, but how do you get from one cash flow to the next? How can you get from one minimum viable product to the next? How you can make the first iteration and get real user feedback to see whether what you're currently working on even makes sense. So if you're forced to rewrite it from scratch, it would mean that you're forced to spend a year of development without knowing whether the result is even worth your while and your money. So there's a few ways you can tackle this in a more gradual way to avoid rewriting it from scratch. The first one is server-side rendering. So server-side rendering is provided in Gutenberg mainly for legacy purposes. And it basically means that you can create a Gutenberg block that will not have any logic itself to render itself, but it will basically be a link to a callback to the server-side PHP environment. So you can provide this callback and say, okay, this function does my rendering. I already have this function. So for example, you might have a plugin that has a shortcode that you make available to your users. You already built the PHP logic to render the output that this shortcode is meant to produce. So the server-side rendering component basically allows you to still reuse all the PHP code that you have for that shortcode. Just instead of tying it to the shortcode syntax, you're tying it to a server-side render component inside of Gutenberg, which can be wrapped into a block. The routes that are being called back. We currently use the Gutenberg namespace. I'm not sure this will stay like that forever. Probably it will change when it will be merged into Core, but right now it's Gutenberg v1/block renderer and then the name of your block. And this API endpoint, you will have registered a callback that maps to this endpoint, and as soon as Gutenberg wants to display your block, it will request the output from this API endpoint and thus trigger your PHP callback. You can find more documentation about this in the official reference. I have a very small example here of how you would register such a callback. This is not entirely complete. There's a JavaScript part missing, but I wanted to concentrate on the PHP side mainly because the JavaScript is just boilerplate. It's always the same, and Gary Pendergast had put out nice documentation about how to go about doing this. Just wanted to show the mechanism. So basically, when you register your block type, as you can see here, you can define the attributes that your block type needs, and then you can define a render callback. And this render callback is a function name that will be called with the attributes, the current attributes of the block, to render it. So you see that this functionality and the view, that's probably something you already have for your shortcuts. So it's only a matter of mapping it to the render callback of a fresh block you create. So many things you can just use from the server side in Gutenberg, so that works for shortcuts, it works for widgets. But as soon as you want to have more complex integrations, where you have your own site inspector integrations or similar things, you will soon hit the problem that you need some way of getting to the data from the client side. Rewriting everything from scratch to have it be put on the REST API is not an easy task, and it's probably very error prone. So I recommend first putting in an abstraction layer that abstracts away the fact that you're currently using the WPMP object, that you're currently using the database in the server, and then below this abstraction layer you can experiment. So I'll discuss a bit how that looks. So basically putting in an abstraction layer is called decoupling something. So we want to decouple the actual persistence from the logic. The logic does whatever you want it to do, but it is based on data. And usually when you build your logic in a WordPress way, you will directly call wp-cli to fetch data from the database. This means that the logic is always directly coupled to the database request. It cannot work without the exact same structure of database being present. So we want to decouple this first. And once we have decoupled it, well, we are very flexible. We can, for example, switch out individual requests to change them from a database request to REST API request. We don't need to do everything all in one go. That's the huge benefit of working with abstractions. behind the abstractions, you can not only replace things, but you can add additional logic that is smart about routing everything so that you can build whatever transitional state you need, and the logic that uses it can be completely unaware of it. I wanted to visualize this a bit. So basically, with your existing code, it probably looks a bit like this. All of your code just directly calls wp-cli or calls the methods that WordPress provides to use wp-cli. It's very difficult in that structure to introduce the REST API. Basically, you would need to completely replace wp-db and replace all the calls that you have in your code to then use with the REST API. So instead, we interject an abstraction layer. This can be as simple as just having the same interfaces that wp-db provides, but just not directly calling wp-db, because then you have a space in between where you can inject additional logic. But it can also be something that's more persistence agnostic. You can have clearer methods of what you're actually doing, instead of having methods like query and flush. You can have methods like fetch all active customers. So the code also becomes much clearer by using such an abstraction layer. And once you have such an abstraction layer in place, it's actually pretty easy to slowly, gradually move from database-backed logic to REST API-backed logic. For those of you who don't have much experience with working with interfaces, an interface basically defines the public-facing side of the code. So it just says, okay, whoever wants to use me, this is how I need to be called. And the rest is a black box. So you can change the rest of the code whenever you feel like. And this black box, it's called the implementation. And here you can see we have an interface book repository, for example, for a bookstore. And we have an implementation wp-db repository that provides one possible implementation of this interface. This one happens to use wp-query to fetch the books, but it could just as well use something else. Now, why would we want to use the REST API on the server side if we haven't yet produced the JavaScript code? Why would we already start at that level? So the REST API, it's a protocol that is meant to bridge the gap between machines. So this, when you think about a remote call does not necessarily mean it needs to go over the network to another physical location and do something. A remote call just means we don't care whether we're on the same machine or not. So if you use the REST API, even at the server level, you can at any point in time just say, okay, I have this code, I have this data that the REST API requests, and well, now I move the data to this other location. And if you happen to use the REST API for that, well, you don't need to change your code at all. You just need to make the REST API base URL aware of where the server can be found. Oftentimes, that's just a DNS change. And then you're good to go. You don't need to change your code anymore. So it makes you very flexible to make changes, and especially when it now comes with the big updates that come with Gutenberg, being flexible is a huge plus. Being flexible might be the difference between you being able to adapt to the upcoming changes, even if they are unexpected changes, or you just being stuck with a code base that you wasted all your cash flow on and you don't know how to proceed. So flexibility is always a big plus. And the REST API is basically the first requirement to go further on with a deeper Gutenberg integration. Because once you move to the client side, there is no database anymore. The database, as you know it in the PHP context, it doesn't exist on the client side. So you cannot directly just say, I now want to read 1,000 rows from the database. The database does not exist. You can only make requests to a server, and that's what you use the REST API. So using REST API controllers in PHP, it's actually not a lot of magic. Just remember that the REST API provides an object model you can work with, and everything that the core does to make the endpoints available is also available to you to use it internally on the server. So here I have a very simple example, the book repository interface that we had before. Here we have now a RESTful book repository, which still implements this find all method, but uses the REST API objects to do this through the REST API. So the REST API is just used as an abstraction so that we don't rely on whether we have access to the database or not. If we do this, we can already experiment with the REST API. We can build our endpoints. We can make sure that everything works as expected, and we can do it one step at a time. We can just take one component and start abstracting away its persistence backend, and then slowly build up our REST API endpoints so that they work with this one component. And once we have all of this done for all of our components, then we're ready for the final step, which is to build, to use the JavaScript client-side code with the React API to build our logic on the client-side. Another challenge you will very probably face is that there will be a transition phase where you cannot just rely on Gutenberg being available for all of your customers. So transition phases are always difficult to deal with. They usually mean that you have to maintain two code bases, that you have to deal with all sorts of weird side effects when you make a change in one branch, all of a sudden the other doesn't work with that change anymore, so you need to reassess what you build, etc., etc. So it's important to know how to best tackle this transition phase. One interesting approach that I saw is to basically mimic the Gutenberg environment, the small parts that you need, in a non-Gutenberg environment. So you can build React components only once, and they will work with or without Gutenberg. So instead of building React components and still having all of the old code playing around and you still need to maintain both, you can build a small wrapper that allows you to reuse the React components on non-Gutenberg sites, and this way you only need to maintain your React components and not two separate code bases. This is actually being used right now by the Yoast SEO plugin. So they have experimented with that to see how far they can take this approach, and right now it's on production on a lot of sites. If you look here on the right side, you can see we have, so this is Gutenberg screen, and you can see on the right side there's an integration that's specific to that plugin that is a React component that is integrated into this inspector on the side. And when you now look at this screen, this is a non-Gutenberg site. So here we have the old post-edit screen, but we still have the same component that is being active on that screen, because what they did is they used the meta box where they put their code in and built the meta box out to be a React container that mimics what Gutenberg does for its React containers. And so all of a sudden you build one component and it is available on all your platforms whether Gutenberg is active or not. The end goal is always to get rid of all the legacy code. So you want to move to Gutenberg only as fast as possible, because it's expensive to keep multiple versions of your code about. So even though this can reduce this cost, the cost is still, depending on how complex your plugin is, the cost is still very high. And all of these tools are just methods of getting you on the critical path to finally be ready for the final step. I forgot that the slide is in. It's a quick view of how the MetaBox function basically produces the components. So it pulls in components that are used normally by Gutenberg, and it produces a MetaBox that uses these components as well, so that it can include its own component in that same container. This is very weird code if you haven't dealt with React so far, so I don't want to go too much into detail. But yeah, so the final step that you want to achieve is the final integration, where you have your new product be Gutenberg only. And this means that, first of all, you need to control fragmentation at all times and get rid of all the old legacy code as soon as possible. So the server-side render code that we had in the beginning, now that we have a REST API endpoint that is available, we want to actually move that to JavaScript code, so that we don't need to keep the PHP code around anymore. Because otherwise, our product is split across half server, half client. You want to also keep your code base as flexible as possible. That's why things like abstractions are so important, because the current editor of Gutenberg, it's just one first step. It is unclear what the next steps will bring in detail, but it's pretty sure that it will not stop at the editor. So more and more of the admin backend will be given the Gutenberg treatment and built in React components on the client side based on REST API endpoints. So keep your code base flexible so that you can move to these new concepts as soon as possible. And finally, once you have everything in place to properly embrace Gutenberg, then really think hard about what the best user experience is in this new environment. So just moving something from a server-based environment to a client-based environment is not necessarily the best user experience, because you just mimic the constraints you had on the server side and force these same constraints on the users on the client side, where they might not be needed. So it's important to think about what the user experience, the ideal user experience should be, and how that could best fit into the Gutenberg context. The key takeaways from this talk. So first of all, this is about having a gradual path to getting ready for Gutenberg. If you can afford to just rewrite everything from scratch, it will probably be cheaper in total cost if you get it right. But for everyone else, going about gradually is probably the safer approach. So do this by reusing existing code through the server-side render component. So just reuse your PHP components that are already tested and mature. Then extract away your data model and move it to the REST API. The REST API is one of the requirements of Gutenberg. Build React containers so that you can have reusable components that work on Gutenberg and non-Gutenberg admin pages, for example. And then as last step, finalize the tight user interface, user experience integration. Make sure that you're not just having the same old code in JavaScript, but make the best use of Gutenberg and seize the opportunity to really rethink your user experience. And all the time stay flexible and adapt to change. Thank you. I think yes.
So you talked about the So you talked about the editor and the rest of the backend roadmap is going to be changing towards using more React components and client-side rendering. I'm curious if you have thoughts about the front end doing the same thing, if there's any sort of standard approach that's been settled on, or if there are tools that you'd recommend for transitioning, in particularly a theme or just like a React single page app. What sort of conventions do you recommend for that type of stuff?
Yes, so right now it's very difficult to make proper recommendations there. Basically, if you go headless CMS, you usually want to make the best use of what WordPress has to offer, and the REST API, if you work on having all the data available through the REST API. So that's an obvious first step of making a headless CMS work. But if you then build everything on the client side, basically create your theming engine on the client side in JavaScript, you will quickly realize that right now WordPress is in a spot where you will have to rebuild a lot of core functionality on the client side just to be able to make sense of the data you get out of the REST API. The REST API, as it is now, it makes some assumptions on how the data is being used, and it does not transform the data in any shape based on what is stored in the database. So the data is still based on the concepts from the server-based rendering engine with the theming and so on. So you will face a lot of issues where you will not be able to directly use the data that you get out of the REST API, but need to produce a lot of additional logic to be able to reuse that. I don't think there's currently a lot of existing tooling. There are a few headless themes to just demonstrate the basic concepts, but they always are very rough around the edges, because a lot of the things you just expect to be part of the WordPress experience is not available anymore, because it never existed on the JavaScript side to begin with. I expect, though, that with Gutenberg moving forward, with the React API slowly becoming more and more complete, that we will see more work being done on actually also providing a proper core provided API for people working on the client side on theming. This hasn't happened yet, but I think it is probably one of the next logical steps once we have all the building blocks in place to work on the client side. Gutenberg is basically the enabler for getting to that point. Thank you.
Which logic currently exists in the scene that is not in the REST API, for example?
So the REST API doesn't contain logic, it only contains data. But for example, your data will contain shortcodes, your data will contain references to all sorts of weird constructs that are normally processed by filters on the server side. And the REST API usually runs all these filters, but some of it does not make sense anymore when you then pass it on to the client side. There's also, for example, the entire user management that you use that just comes out of the box where people can log in, etc. You need to rebuild all that stuff if you want to use it.
So if you set up a nonce, right, and you send it to the REST API to headers, the REST API knows who you are and which permissions you have. So I think I've all the headless CMS, and actually 80% of the experience was into it. It's less complex as it sounds. That's what I wanted to mention.
Yeah, it certainly depends on what you're actually building. So if you're building a mostly static site, then you only use some parts of the WordPress core experience, and then it makes perfect sense. But for example, I had discussions with a client where they had an intranet they wanted to make faster to have everything happen on the client side. And at that point, the current state of WordPress meant that it was just not a good fit as a backend for that anymore. Because it would basically mean that we'd have the WordPress backend that we need to maintain, that we need to keep updated, etc. And we had to rebuild a lot of logic, a lot of functionality on the client side as well. So depending on what you're actually trying to build, it's easier or less easy. But you need to be aware that a lot of what WordPress provides currently is provided on the server side.
Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you for your talk. Just a clarification, I'm not that familiar with Gutenberg. In terms of the plugins that are most affected by this right now, would that be any plugins that interface with the editor? So that would be anything dealing with meta boxes, custom fields, and those types of things? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so the things most affected are in this first step, everything that directly ties into the post editor, the editing page, the meta boxes, etc. But also plugins, for example, that deal directly with the content might be affected because the layout of the content will slightly change. The blocks are encoded into the content in the database in form of HTML comments. So if you have, for example, a plugin that just splits HTML comments, then all your blocks are gone. So there are a few areas like this where a plugin might not directly be tied to the post-edit screen, but still have a negative impact on what Gutenberg does.
So anything basically pulling the content out, you have to be careful in terms of what types of filters you're using on it.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.